Karen's going to be giving a talk entitled I want to be judged for my work. I don't want to be judged as a person, race, gender and cultural value in UK craft. So I'm looking forward to hearing all about that. And just to give you a bit of biographical information about Karen, I'm sure some of you know her work already. But so Karen is a research fellow at Birmingham City University. She's also the director for the Centre for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in the Arts, or how do you say the acronym, Karen?
Yeah.
CEDIA, sorry. Okay, yeah, so CEDIA. And she's lead of the AHRC funded Innovation Fellows Project Craft Expertise. Her research interests include inequalities in craft and the creative industries, cultural workers' use of social media, and the politics of expertise in cultural work. She is author of the book, The Politics of Expertise in Cultural Labour, Arts, Work, Inequalities, and co-editor of Craft Entrepreneurship. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Karen. And I think you've got some slides, Karen, to share, so please feel free to share those now. And really looking forward to hearing the talk and to the questions at the end.
Thanks, Gilly, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this group. And yeah, apologies for the acronyms. At BCU, we love an acronym. So CEDIA is just one of them. So in this talk today, I'm going to focus on the research that I've been doing with the Crafts Council for the past 2 years, looking at inequalities in craft and focusing mainly on race and gender. First, I'll provide a bit of context in terms of inequalities in the UK professional craft sector and discuss the findings from my fieldwork, which reveal how the women in this research experienced racism, microaggressions, and feeling like their work was judged unfairly. Then, drawing on the work of Beverly Skeggs and Satnam Verdi, I'll discuss how value hierarchies in craft are grounded in regimes of value, where certain people and certain cultures are deemed more valuable than others. And I'll also use the work of Janet Wolfe to discuss how hierarchies of cultural value in craft can be challenged or reframed to potentially open up the world of professional craft to people from all backgrounds. So the quote at the top is from Richard Sennett's book, The Craftsman. So in his book, Sennett claims that almost anyone can be good at craft. And as stated in this quote, he says that society sorts people along a strict gradient of ability. The better you are at something, the fewer of you there are, and craftsmanship doesn't fit into this framework. And while this could be true, and there are many people who like to make as a hobby because they enjoy it, very few are actually able to turn a passion into craft, for craft into a full-time living, and even fewer are able to be regarded as masters of their craft, particularly if they're not white, able-bodied and male. Angela McRobbie draws on the work of Sennett in her book Be Creative, in her critique of the creativity dispositif, the new way of working in the creative industries. And she acknowledges that Sennett's work on craft is a useful bridge for thinking about how old and new ways of working in the creative industries. And she also talks about the value of craft. However, Sennett's work has its shortcomings when looked through the lens of gender, and I would argue race too. McRobbie notes that Sennett's argument about the dignity of labour, doing craft for its own sake, making that concentrated effort, actually endorses an elevated notion of craft. Could I just check, Julie, that you can see my slides? Yeah, okay. I just had a pop-up from Zoom for some reason. So McRobbie on Sennett says that the obsessive commitment that Sennett depicts of the ideal craftsperson is far removed from the women crafters of today selling things on Etsy. With the rise of digital media, the realm of craft has opened up far beyond the realms of concentration and attention to detail as described by Sennett. And this raises questions about gender and new hierarchies within the arts and crafts of the present day cultural economy. So these two quotes that I've picked out here frame the ambiguity of craft expertise. Craftsmanship and master crafting as terms have traditionally masculine connotations. And as McRobbie points out, traditional ideas and value hierarchies of craft are gendered despite the rise of digital media and Etsy. However, in cultural labour literature, which is where my work sits, there's been relatively little work done on race and intersections of race, class and gender oppression in UK professional craft. So my work that I'm talking about here seeks to address this gap. Before I move on to the findings from my field work, I just want to say a bit more about expertise and why it's of interest to me in the context of craft. So in my book, which came out last year, The Politics of Expertise in Cultural Labour, I look at how cultural workers signal their expertise on social media. And by signalling expertise, I mean communicating skills, knowledge, networks, and credentials online. And in the book, I problematise the idea of the expert in cultural work. So the figure of the expert and what does expertise entail in cultural work, rather than focusing on the people who are normally considered to be experts in the creative sector. For example, critics, dealers, and intermediaries. I focus on the aesthetic expertise of the artist, their skills and knowledge, and how that's manifest in the cultural object. I also highlight the gendered nature of expertise in two ways. First, how the figure of the expert and the genius artist are commonly associated with masculinity. And second, I highlight how a cultural worker's ability to develop their aesthetic expertise is determined by the prevailing conditions of cultural work, which reinforce gender and class inequalities. So, for example, a number of the women in this book described how they didn't have the time or space to produce art because of additional responsibilities, such as caring responsibilities or working in additional part-time jobs. Something I pick up on in the book but don't really elaborate on is how the figure of the expert tends to be associated with whiteness as well. And this is something I've picked up on in my current work on craft, particularly in relation to cultural value. Some work has been done in this area. So, for example, Annapurna Mamidipudi discussed the expertise of handloom weavers in India, and she described how the women were the ones doing all of the work. They were the ones with the practical craft expertise, but it was devalued because it was carried out by women. And she talks about the hierarchies of cultural value in handloom weaving, which requires a great deal of skill and expertise, but it was the men in the industry who took all of the credit and acclaim for their work. So Mamidipudi's work highlights how women's work is devalued, and this has been going on in craft for a long time and arguably persists today as well. And in the UK context, I will show how value judgments are arguably influenced by class and race too. So despite Sennett's idea that seemingly anyone could become a master craftsperson, the current research suggests that professional craft is marked by inequalities. So in their book, Culture is Bad for You, Brooke O'Brien and Taylor show that of those people working in the top end of the craft sector, so full-time secure work as a craft maker, only 22% of those are women and 92% are white. Susan Luckman and Jane Andrew, who focus more on the Australian context, they say that the contemporary designer maker economy is marked by its whiteness. And they say that this is apparent not only in the profile of the makers working in the profession, but also the customers and the aesthetics of what is being made. And I'll come back to that theme later on. Back to the UK, and the Crafts Council's most recent industry report, The Market for Craft, shows that since 2006, the proportion of makers in the professional sector who are from ethnically diverse backgrounds has remained static at between 2 to 4%. So that means in the past 15 years, there's been no change in the ethnic diversity of professional craft, which is a concern given how for most of that time, it has become easier to start a craft business with the rise of online craft platforms such as Etsy and Folksy, which seemingly allow anyone to make a career out of craft or have at least lowered the barriers to market. So in that report, the Crafts Council acknowledged that the sector has to go further to ensure craft is an inclusive space for all ethnicities and genders. And I've been working in collaboration with the Crafts Council on my current project since 2019. The project is called Craft Expertise and it's funded by the AHRC's Innovation Fellowship Scheme. And the research I'm talking about today comes from the first phase, which was between 2019 to 21. And we're now in the second phase, which ends in 2023. And the aims of the first phase of the project were to get a sense of the challenges that makers from marginalised groups face. And I was interested in the intersection of race and gender in particular, following on from my work on expertise and the figure of the expert. And I wanted to interrogate this in craft and use the findings to create recommendations for the UK professional craft sector. And these phase 1 findings have been published in the report, Making Changes in Craft, which is available on the project website and on the Crafts Council website. The findings are based on interviews I carried out with 21 women makers of colour working in professional craft. They're all based in the UK. And I also carried out some observations at craft studios before COVID-19. 2 key themes emerged from these interviews. 1, the prevalence of racism and microaggressions in professional craft. And 2, makers feeling like their work was devalued or judged unfairly by others, including potential customers, fellow makers, and judging panels. And both of these themes, I suggest, play some part in the relationship between cultural value and inequality in craft. So many of the makers I spoke to had experienced some form of racism or microaggression during their craft career, with incidents occurring in spaces, various spaces such as fairs and studios, and even when dealing with suppliers. And these experiences make it difficult for the makers to feel included in craft communities. So microaggressions are behaviours, assumptions, looks, or comments which may not be outwardly racist, but can make the recipient feel undermined or othered. And at the other end of the scale is outright racism, which wasn't frequently mentioned by the participants. But one of the most striking, one of the worst examples was Sophie, quoted here, a craft artist based in Newcastle. And she experienced it at a craft fair in the region. So she told me about a fellow stall holder who was an older white man, came over to her and said, "Oh yeah, we don't want brown people here." And she said, "It was so in my face, it was horrible. Unfortunately, apparently that is kind of like the norm at some markets and it's a bit strange." Anita, who is a craft artist based in London, said how she's experienced some anti-Muslim comments, such as a fellow studio holder coming up to her and saying, "You're not a Muslim, are you?" And comments such as this, she said, made her feel like an outsider in the studios. And she talked to me about how she dreaded going there every day. Some makers were also made to feel like they don't belong in craft spaces because their presence or certain achievements were sometimes downplayed or reduced to a form of box ticking. So for example, Julia, who's of Caribbean heritage and based in London, talked about an instance when she'd won an award and someone pointed to her skin and said, "Oh, did this work for you then?" Implying that she'd only won the award because she was Black and not because of her craft skill. Back to Anita, and she told me she was literally told by someone in her studios, "You're only here to tick a box." And that was in relation to a major commission that she got from the British royal family. And she told me how that achievement was dismissed by other people in her studios, with people telling her she was only picked for the commission because she was Asian. So this idea of box ticking denigrates the achievements of these makers. It dismisses the work they would have put in to get into those studios or get those commissions and awards. And again, it makes them feel like they don't belong in craft. And the idea of box ticking is linked to perceptions of cultural value in craft, who is seen as expert and whose work is deemed to be of high quality. And research on the creative industries and cultural policy sort of highlights this link between inequality and cultural value. So, for example, the work of Kate Oakley, Dave O'Brien, and Ellie Belfiore, who I've quoted here. So Belfiore acknowledges that in the UK, the cultural industries and the question of cultural value is an area for power struggles and a site for inequality. The struggle is for meaning, representation, and recognition in the creative and cultural industries. So in the context of craft and the women that I've interviewed for this research, these power relations are experienced as intersectional oppression, overlapping systems of prejudice and discrimination, which they felt affected how their work is judged by others in the craft sector and affects how they're treated. And the work of Black feminist theory, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, is important for me for conceptualizing these overlapping systems of oppression. So I've mentioned judgment and value a few times. And when I talk about judgment in this context, I don't just mean like interviews or judging panels for funding or prizes, but actually everyday interactions with potential customers, fellow makers and suppliers, for example. So Tina mentioned here, she's of South Asian heritage and she has a jewellery studio in London. She's been based there for 20 years, really well established in her field. And she described her experience at an open studio event. So she says, I've sometimes had people say to me, and usually to be people of a certain age and of a certain demographic, and they'll say, is this all made here in the UK? Or do you make this yourself? Or is it made here or is it made abroad? Why would they ask me that? So Tina felt that the origin of her work was being questioned because of her ethnicity. And she told me about another incident where a customer bought some earrings from her and they were £150. And he said to her, when they break, can I come back to you? And Tina's quite taken aback by that comment. And she said, well, if you have any problems, you can bring the piece back. But she said, looking back, I'd wish I'd pulled him up and said, that's not a very nice thing to say because you're questioning me and the quality of my workmanship. So what I described there with Tina is an example of the evaluative moment in craft. Simon Stewart argues that in studies of cultural production, more attention should be paid to the moment when cultural objects and their aesthetic qualities are evaluated by others. So Stewart talks about the dynamics of the evaluative moment, which include the presence of other people and the influence that they bear. Our evaluation of a cultural object is often something that's at least in part a result of dialogue with peers, as well as wider societal forces. And our judgment will be influenced by the presence of others. So you can hear that this is influenced by Goffman's work on performance. So in the case of Tina, her presence as a maker, she felt it had some bearing on the dynamics of the evaluative moment, because she said she felt that if she were white, she would not be asked if her jewellery was made abroad and thus not British, or she would not be asked if her jewellery would break or implicitly seen as of poorer quality. However, it's not only the presence of the maker themselves which can influence evaluative judgments. There are, of course, wider social and cultural factors to consider. So, for example, Childress and Nault highlight how intermediaries in publishing select manuscripts which are based on cultural proximity to themselves, and they call it cultural matching. And they describe how race in particular is a marker of cultural similarity and difference, whereby intermediaries to quote them, select and pass on manuscripts along culturally inscribed racialized lines. And this results in inequalities faced by non-white authors during the publishing process. So their work and the work of Simon Stewart mostly applies to cultural intermediaries and their role in selecting work. However, the idea of cultural matching and people being drawn to art and objects which they can relate to could also be an underlying factor in the evaluative moment. And I think there's a link between cultural matching and the entrenched ideas of the type of craft that women in professional craft and ethnically diverse women in particular should be making. And this came up in the interviews as well. So Anita talked about the idea of British craft when talking about the type of work that she's expected to produce as an Asian maker. So she said, craft is associated as something uniquely British. So I can't be seen to be doing a British craft because I'm not British. On the one hand, I'm not allowed to do what's British, but on the same extent, I'm not allowed to do what's culturally mine either. So I'm in a lose-lose situation. Anita and some of the other interviewees felt restricted by a framework of a British craft aesthetic, which is marked by whiteness. So jeweler, Rebecca is a jeweler based in Birmingham. She voiced similar concerns to Anita about the type of jewellery that she's expected to make, and it has an impact on how she defines herself as a jeweler. So she said that it is hard to describe myself as a jeweler because people don't always understand. They have a certain perception of either someone who obviously makes Asian jewellery or traditional jewellery. They don't quite get that I'm quite versatile in what I do. My work that relates to my culture doesn't sell. And Rebecca talked about how she made a collection which was inspired by her Indian heritage, but it never got selected for shows and it didn't sell. And this affected her confidence and direction in her work. And she said to me, it was almost like it was too Asian to be contemporary, but not commercial enough to sell. And these issues with getting work adequately recognised is also summarised by Rita, quoted at the bottom of the slide. And she's a knitwear designer based in London. And she said, you so often remember that people's first look at you is based on what they see and not on your work. So the moments of judgment that I've described here are all examples of how judgments about cultural value of objects created by women of colour in craft are in these cases not always made on the basis of the objects themselves. Instead, such judgments, whether by customers or people in the studio, are grounded in structures and institutions of relative and differential power, to quote Janet Wolfe. All the work on judgment in the creative industries I've talked about here, the work of Stewart and Childress and Nault, that can help to explain how evaluations about the value of cultural objects can be influenced by the presence of others as well as cultural proximity. In other words, people tend to favour things that they can relate to. And when a sector or a space is quite homogenous, that presents a problem for marginalised groups who are trying to make a career in craft or indeed in the wider creative industries. While the analysis of the evaluative moment and its relation to cultural value could go some way to explaining these individual and group behaviours in the process of judgment, the prevalence of racism and microaggressions experienced directly by the makers interviewed points to a much wider issue related to how value can be placed on people. So the professional craft sector in which these women are in, it sits within a wider system, a wider capitalist system. And the development of this, as Satnam Verdi highlights, is entangled with racism. So Verdi talks about the development of racialized capitalism over centuries, arguing that racism's rise was incremental yet relentless over the course of modernity's unfolding. And capitalism was able to advance through a process of racial categorization. And he talks about how this eroded working class solidarity during industrial capitalism in the UK. And this led to a form of socialist nationalism gaining traction during the 60s and 70s, where, to quote Verdi, the British state, employers and workers had come to internalise a common British nationalism underpinned by a shared allegiance to whiteness. And I can't go into it in too much detail here, but I find Verdi's historical account really useful to help understand how people can be valued on the basis of their race and how this is imbricated within the development of capitalism. And an understanding of how capitalism is racialized and hierarchical is essential for informing accounts of inequalities and racism, as Beverly Skeggs notes. Whiteness is both material and ideological, another crucial concept that we lost in the hegemony of the perspective of the privilege, always connected to value. Without understanding the development of capitalism and its methods, we can't fully understand how class, race, gender, and sexuality as classificatory systems of value proceed into the present. So for me, the works of Skeggs and Verdi can help to contextualise how makers of colour, and women makers of colour in particular, are not likely to be judged in the same way as a maker who's white and male. And in many cases, they experience racism and microaggressions in craft spaces, which are often dominated by white people. And the unequal system of capitalism underpins these conditions within which they're trying to make a living from their craft. And it could determine the extent to which their craft expertise is recognised and understood. So how could this be addressed? So far in this talk, I've focused mainly on how people are discriminated against or judged, and how a person's presence could have some bearing on the judgment of the cultural objects they produce. However, I also want to consider how the objects themselves, in particular certain forms of craft techniques and traditions, are valued and hierarchical. So returning back to the work of Skeggs, she talks about the link between ideas of European personhood and particular models of commodity exchange, and thus the denigration of other ways of relating to people and objects outside of disinterest in the object and interest in profit and commodity exchange. And these processes produce regimes of value, which essentially underpin ideas about who and what matters. And I suggest that regimes of value produce the conditions and criteria through which craft objects are judged. So the women in this research, is worth noting, are British. They're all inculcated within this westernised, Eurocentric regime of value. As British women, they've been educated through it, they're embedded within it. But the problem is that this regime of value originated through a system of capitalism which privileges whiteness, and through a set of aesthetic codes and classifications which were created mostly by white privileged men. So this is why, as Anita described, she's in a lose-lose situation where within this system, her ethnicity and the types of work that she's producing leads others to believe that she's not supposed to create work within this framework, a framework which values the aesthetics of whiteness and at times can exclude marginalised groups. So in her sociological work on aesthetics, Janet Wolfe talks about how theories of post-colonialism, race and gender have exposed the myth of objectivity in Western art history. Wolfe acknowledges that there are both aesthetic and extra aesthetic value judgments at play, which exclude women, people of colour and non-Western artists from the canon. In an attempt to address this, Wolfe developed an approach which recognises aesthetic criteria as grounded in community, where criteria for the judgment of works of art is a result of reflexive discussion within communities of interpretation, as she calls it, which are located within a specific culture or specific values. So Wolfe's aim here is to avoid universalising judgments about the value of cultural objects. So when thinking about how craft objects created by the women in my research are judged, Wolfe's work indicates that one possible way of addressing this is that judgments need to be made reflexively and more transparently and within different communities rather than just against a set of established hierarchical patriarchal standards. And Woolf talks about the artist Kathleen Mchenry, whose work she rediscovered and she curated for an exhibition. And Woolf wondered on what grounds she thought Mchenry's work was any good, to quote her. This is because Mchenry was marginalised when she moved away from New York, and her work seemingly became more provincial, to use Woolf's words, and increasingly associated with amateurism. So the social and historical context of Mchenry's marginalisation for Woolf allows her then to address the question of whether the work was any good. So Woolf found that Mchenry's credentials, such as high-profile exhibitions that she's done, as well as Woolf's own judgment of the work based on her own sort of aesthetics training, her own knowledge, this all assisted her judgment. And Woolf talks about how this context of the marginalisation of this particular artist revealed gendered hierarchies at play, and to quote Woolf, the complex intersection of the aesthetic and the political. So Woolf shows that aesthetic judgments need to be fully contextualised, and ideally as a reasoned outcome of dialogue and communication at the basis of community. In the case of the makers featured in this research who were involved in the UK professional craft sector, I've talked about how the cultural objects that they produced have been judged and valued, and I've showed how they, as people, have been judged as well. And what's being described here has taken place largely on an interpersonal level, quite a banal, everyday level. And this can somewhat be explained by matters of personal preference, individual prejudices, as well as cultural proximity, but it's also contextualised by wider mechanisms of regimes of value where certain types of craft and maker are seemingly valued more than others. This Woolf's idea of community evaluation can't address the wider structural racism which is embedded in UK society, but in professional crafts, some steps could be taken to move towards mechanisms of judgment and representation which are more transparent. So this can involve, for example, including a wider variety of people from all different backgrounds and craft traditions, involving them more in decision making, having them higher up in influential craft organisations, and including and diversifying show selection panels, funding panels, and so on. So to begin to wrap this up now, I'm just going to bring this back to expertise, which I introduced at the beginning of the talk, and propose that communities of craft evaluation should also consider craft expertise. So this means that while criteria will include contextualised judgments, it should also include judgments made on the actual skill in mastering tools and techniques to produce the work. And such an approach would help to not only appreciate the effort and skill of the creator, but also evaluate the qualities of the object produced, the aesthetic qualities of that work. It would also help to foster objective respect, as mentioned by Mark Banks. So in other words, to respect cultural objects and practices by evaluating them in terms of their own objective qualities, as well as their subjective apprehension and value. Expertise can be really difficult to judge, but it could be based on an appraisal of the craft techniques and knowledge exhibited by the maker and manifest in the object. And these judgments, of course, need to be made by a wider diversity of people from different craft traditions who have that knowledge, who have that context in order for this to work. And such an approach can attempt to take a little more focus away from the outward appearance of the person doing the work and to work towards the object itself and how it was created. As one of the interviewees, Olivia, who is a craft artist of West African heritage based in London, said, "When I'm in spaces like that," she means professional studios and craft fairs, "I always look at the work first. Obviously, I notice if there are no ethnic minorities there, but I always look at the work first because I think that's what, if anything, it should be judged on." That's what I want to be judged on, my work. I don't want to be judged as a person. What I've discussed in this final section about community evaluation and judgment won't put an end to racism and microaggressions which makers from marginalised groups experience. In my report for the Crafts Council, I've recommended that codes of conduct should be drawn up for craft spaces and studios, so there's more accountability and more active anti-racist action in these spaces, which are often unsafe for women and women of colour. There's a very long way to go in the UK professional craft sector to make it more inclusive. And myself and makers I know and work with on anti-racist action, we're always coming up against difficulties and obstacles. And a lot of uncomfortable conversations still need to be had in the sector. And we still need more organisations to be allies and be open to listening, which is a very long process. One sort of milestone moment was the opening of the We Gather exhibition, which opened at the Crafts Council Gallery on the 17th of November, and it features 5 works that I commissioned as part of the Craft Expertise project, and they're all by ethnically diverse women based in the UK. And the exhibition celebrates their work, the work of Black and Asian makers, and highlights the themes in my research around racism and cultural value that I've spoken about today. The Crafts Council Gallery has had very few exhibitions like this in its history, so I hope it's the start of a journey towards being more inclusive and not the end point. And I think what was important in the process of, for example, hiring the curators for this, the whole process of putting the exhibition together is that the people involved were all from all different backgrounds, all different craft traditions, and I think it informs the way the Crafts Council, hopefully, the way they do things in the future. Unfortunately, because of COVID, the Crafts Council Gallery closed this week temporarily, but the exhibition is still there and will hopefully reopen in the new year, and it will be on until February, March time. That's going to be confirmed. So if you are in London early next year, and hopefully, if you're allowed, feel free to pop in and take a look, restrictions permitting. So I'll end my talk there. Thank you all so much for listening. That was a bit of a really quick whistle-stop tour through the research, so I'm happy to answer any questions you may have and expand on anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was really, really fascinating. And yeah, I mean, I have lots and lots of questions. So if anybody has a question, then you're very welcome to ask one. So I can wait to see if anybody asks a question. If not, I have a whole list of questions that I've got ready to ask you. So I'll open it up first to see if anybody has a question, first of all. Sarah, you've put your video on and I'm thinking, would you like to ask a question, or are you just you're just revealing yourself?
I was just revealing myself, but yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I don't really have a question, but I am super interested in this because I'm part of the knitting and spinning community, you know, online, and there's just been so much over the last 2 years, maybe a bit longer, but it has properly just kicked off, and it's been I mean, fairly awful to watch. And I didn't even, I work in Coventry, and I didn't even know that your project was going on. So I'm really interested, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about it as well. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. And yeah, I've been keeping an eye on that since 2019 when it all kicked off, and it's just been, yeah, it's awful what's going on. And not something I mentioned in this, but it's definitely a part of the research, just keeping tabs on those conversations and the constant racism controversies that seem to be coming out in the knitting community at the moment.
Yeah.
That sort of relates to the question that I was going to sort of to kick off with, which is about the sort of time frame of your analysis. Has obviously happened in the sort of period of sort of, you know, seismic rupture of COVID, and then obviously the sort of increased visibility of Black Lives Matter in 2020. So I was just wondering if you could say something about the time frame of the research that you've been doing and how these sort of seismic events have shaped the research you've done and your findings.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, things definitely got busier after like spring 2020 and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and that was because of the project partner Crafts Council. So I don't know if anyone saw it, but they posted something on Instagram to support Blackout Tuesday, and they got a big backlash from the maker community, basically saying, well, where have you been in terms of racism and inequalities in craft up until now? So I think that all of that really forced them to look at what they're doing and really reevaluate what they're doing. And even though I'd been working with them for a year before that, this work suddenly, it shot up the priority list. But it wasn't without sort of struggle and me having to go to them and say, you know, do you need help with this? Do you need, like, I can help you, like, consult with the community on these things. So it's took a lot of learning from them in terms of the way they work and the way they engage with makers, and it's quite a long process, but there were definite there was a definite difference after sort of Black Lives Matter in terms of what was coming out in the interviews as well. There was a bit more positivity in terms of people feeling like things might change in craft. I think as I move into this second phase where the focus is going to slightly shift away from the professional sector, I'm looking more at community crafts and social enterprises, looking at that in terms of sort of good practice with inclusivity, but also keeping tabs on the research that I've done and the sort of tracking the impact of that and the reception of that and whether the recommendations are actually going to be used. So there's a definite, I sensed a difference in the way that things were being talked about, but it'll be interesting to see if the momentum is sustained.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I mean, I do have lots more questions, but I don't want to hog abuse my privilege as chair. So please feel free to type a question in the chat box, or if anybody has a question, just feel free to share your mic. So any questions for Karen, very welcome. I was wondering, Karen, if you could, well, we just maybe wait. Oh, Isaac, you've appeared. No, you've gone. He just gave us a glimpse and he's disappeared again. As somebody that's this isn't my area, and I'm really fascinated to learn more about it. I was just wondering if you could say something about craft in the context, I guess, the cultural industries more generally, and about how craft more broadly is kind of valued in cultural policy, how much it's a part of debates around cultural policy and cultural industries, and I'd be really fascinated to know that.
Yeah, sure. So Susan Luckman, in her book Craft as a Creative Industry, she talks about craft sort of tenuous status as a creative industry. Like it had to fight to be recognised as a part of the creative industries. And I think that's because of its sort of associations with amateur practice is very strongly linked to domestic making, and a lot of women also, the sort of women dominated aspects of craft practice as well. So it's like that domesticated home making, which isn't there's not much value placed on it in the creative industry. So it's going back to that thing of women's work being devalued. So Susan Luckman talks about that, and how at the other end of the scale, you've got organisations like the Crafts Council who are trying to elevate craft and promote it as a creative industry, and they've done a lot of lobbying for that. But what's interesting is the context of what I've been talking about here. It's been quite a narrow, high art version of craft, which is very removed from the type of craft and forms of craft expertise that a lot of people are practicing. And that's something that the Crafts Council are now trying to address and expand the types of craft that they promote. So I think the Crafts Council have done a lot of good work in getting it recognised within that creative industries umbrella. But it's obviously not as prominent as other industries yet in the discourse. So I'm hoping that's what this project and this research at least creates, that sort of space in the literature and addresses those gaps.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And yeah, I can see that Laura has typed a question in the chat box and can't come on camera because as Laura's out and about at the moment, so that's fine. So the question is, are there certain specific crafts and products that are seen to be based around whiteness and expertise, or that are seen as normative? It isn't Laura's field either, so this question could be way off base, but yeah, so what would you say to that, Karen?
I think I'll refer back to Susan Luckman again, who talks about Etsy. So she did a study of Etsy, and on there you have like a shop front, and she talks about how the sort of the types of makers on Etsy that they used to promote, where it was dominated by this sort of white hipster aesthetic. So you've got that element of it, this sort of Etsy-preneur aspect, but I think they're trying to address that. And I think in terms of whiteness and masculinity, crafts such as carpentry and woodwork, which it talks about quite a lot, I think those masculinized forms of craft are quite obviously, I think, are quite associated with whiteness. But I think it's most disciplines in craft are in terms of race. And then, but obviously that's in the UK professional context. There are lots of different techniques and traditions which have a sort of, which are from around the world, and which are sort of inspiring makers over here. But then you've got issues around cultural appropriation as well, which is a fascinating but really important part of it as well. But there's people like Rose Sinclair, she's at Goldsmith, she's done much better work than me on that particular aspect. She'll know a lot more about that.
Does that link into what you were saying about the sort of there is a particular British craft aesthetic that you were talking about? So yeah, I was interested to know what that looks like. What is that?
Yeah, so it's sort of it's hard to sort of characterize, but it's I can't remember the name of the pic, but there was an article on British craft, and it's sort of linking into ideas of nostalgia, like post-war nostalgia, and that keep calm, carry on sort of that sort of twee Britishness, that sort of aesthetic that's quite apparent in sort of early Great British Bake Off. So it's that kind of feel to it. Yeah, sorry, I can't remember the authors of that article, but it was something about keep calm and carry on, and it was that type of dominant aesthetic which Anita, in my research, she had she said she clearly doesn't fit into that, but when she does her own work, they're like, well, that's not going to sell either. So it's quite difficult.
Yeah, as soon as you said keep calm and carry on, I was like, oh yes, I know what you're talking about now. I can picture it. And Laura's just posted another comment saying, thank you. I sold frames around the horror film Midsummer on Etsy, so I definitely fit into that white hipster framework. Yeah, so I mean, it would be really interesting to hear from, oh, Isaac. Isaac's coming in.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, thanks for that, Karen. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that. And I was just thinking about the question was forming in my head, and then you touched on it there around kind of ideas of like tweeness and this kind of idealized version of Britishness. And I was thinking about the kind of relationship between this kind of twee amateurism is this kind of ideal vision of craft, and the relations between your participants, and I don't know where they're based, but if it's they're a predominantly urban based sample, that kind of inability for sort of people who see craft very much in this kind of twee amateurishness and this kind of urban multicultural British identity, this kind of inability to kind of make the connections between that and Britishness, and this kind of more kind of convivial form of Britishness, I guess. I didn't know if that was something that might be a kind of one of the drivers of these kind of you know, some of the kind of nonsense comments that your participants had to put up with, this kind of inability to kind of reconcile two forms of Britishness, I guess, as expressed through craft in this instance. I don't know if there's something to be said on that.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. That's really interesting. Yeah, they are all based, I think all of them are based in cities. It's interesting you say that, because a couple of them acknowledged the sort of demographics of the studios where they were based, and one of them might have been Anita, who said a lot of the people here who were like studio holders here, they're young girls, so they come from these rural areas, they come to university, but they just mix with their own sort of peer groups, which tend to be white. So they come from a rural area, they go through the craft curriculum at university, which is mostly white and Eurocentric, and then they come here and they don't expand out of that. That's what she said. So I think there was something in that to do with that sort of disconnect, which isn't helped by craft education, which is very Eurocentric as well. So I think there is something in that possibly, but yeah, really interesting. Thank you, and congratulations.
Yes, congratulations, Isaac. And I think that links to the another comment that Laura's posted about how this twee Britishness is very interesting, and in terms of Kirsty Allsop and neoliberal motherhood. So that links to something that I was going to ask you about, I guess, about broader sort of like popular culture representations of craft and how important these are in sort of shaping these ideas about who is a craftsperson, what counts as craft. So has that come into your research at all, about sort of popular culture representations and ideas of, I think you talked about like the figure of the craftsperson and the crafts worker. So how significant do you see people as like Kirsty Allsop and others like that?
Funnily enough, when was it? Very early on in this project, the producers of one of her shows actually came to me and said, can you recommend diverse makers for our upcoming show? So I sent them a list of like people I knew. So I found that interesting. It's not something I've written about, but it's definitely something I watch closely and keep an eye on, and that I'm really interested in. So I have noticed in recent years, especially since last year, there is a greater representation of people from different ethnicities on these shows. So All That Glitters, for example, I actually knew one of the contestants on there, and it was filmed at my university School of Jewellery as well. I noticed on shows like Blown Away, Great British Sewing Bee, that you can see that there's efforts there to ensure that it's quite ethnically diverse on those shows. So it's possibly a future article or something, because it is something I'm keeping tabs on.
Great, thank you. Sarah, I was wondering if you wanted to come back if you had a question at this point, because I know that you, because you're so obviously have some really interesting insights into this area. So is there anything else that you wanted to ask or just come back on?
Yeah, I did have a thought, which I think it kind of came out of what Isaac said, which is I wonder if there's an element, and I mean, my knowledge is almost entirely in knitting and spinning and dyeing, kind of yarn type crafts, but there's a kind of ongoing thing in the knitting amateur or small business world where there's a lack of understanding about the amount of time it takes to make something and the amount of value that there is in it, because it has been handmade by a person who is not in a factory somewhere working horrific hours. I just kind of wondered whether there's some kind of connection to it's more acceptable for middle-class white women to be selling sweaters at a reasonable price than it is from someone who's from a BME, who's a person of colour, or who's even, I mean, who's male even, because it's not the norm. And it's kind of why are you charging me so much for this? And I don't really know whether I have a point for this, but I just suddenly thought of it when Isaac was talking, and I think it's quite an interesting thing. I don't know. I feel like people who aren't white, who are selling at the same prices as people who are white, get more grief, and that's entirely anecdotal.
Yeah, that's really interesting you mentioned that, and it's something I've heard from a lot of interviewees. I've interviewed a couple of knitters as well, and it's definitely there. It sort of speaks to what I was saying, the sort of theoretical work that I've been drawing on by Beverly Skeggs and Satnam Verdi about sort of race, gender and cultural value, because and this is why I think expertise is interesting, because it takes into account that time and that effort and that development of expertise over time, which I think if you are in a position to make judgments on craft and on craft expertise, you would recognise that. It was really interesting. So one of the makers in the exhibition, she posted on Instagram her whole process, and she was saying it took me 8 hours to do this, like these couple of lines, and she really communicated the sort of the effort and time that went into it, and hopefully the Crafts Council are going to acquire her work, so that time and effort will be recognised, and she'll be hopefully get a decent amount of money for it. But yeah, it's a really interesting point.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have a final question? So we've probably got a few more minutes if anybody would like to ask a question or comment or tell us about their own crafting experiences. Yeah, so would anybody like to post a question or share your mic?
Is it all right if I go?
Yeah, of course, please do.
Thank you, Karen. That was really cool. Did any of your participants kind of have this sort of post-feminist sensibility that gender didn't matter? Were they all kind of engaged that gender related to the value of their work, or not?
No, I didn't get the sense of that. I think craft is a weird one because for the people I spoke to, they often talked about how there were so few men where they worked, and how like a couple of them were like, oh yeah, there's one man downstairs and it's so cool, you know, he's here in this women dominated space. So yeah, I found that quite interesting. But a lot of the experiences and conversations seem to centre on race and issues around how they were treated because of their race, which is layered with gender, definitely, especially the higher up you go in craft, and in terms of how much money you're paid for work, and the sort of acclaim that you get. But I think maybe because of no one I worked with was at that top level, no one I spoke to was there quite yet. So that didn't really come up, but it I'm sure it will emerge in the future if I speak to anyone who sort of gets to work more with the crafts council and gets to work in that sort of that upper tier of craft.
That's really interesting. Tiff, can I just ask, is there a particular reason you asked that? Is that something you might expect, or that you've seen in your own kind of work, this post-feminist sensibility?
Yeah, so I research people who work in, well, women who work in costume departments in film and television. One of my sort of surprising findings was that how many people didn't want to engage with questions of being a woman and how their work was valued. They didn't want to sort of think that, or say they gender doesn't matter. It was the classic gender doesn't matter anymore, we're all treated equally. But all of my participants have been white middle class women. So yeah, it was just notable that, like, how especially because what I thought was really obvious, like sewing, costume is in my mind a really feminized labor, but the consensus was like, oh no, gender doesn't matter anymore, type thing. Yeah, which was really surprising for me. So I just wondered if you'd had something similar or not.
No, I didn't get that sense. Really, it was like we spoke mostly about race, but I didn't get the sense that gender doesn't matter. I think it was intersectional, it was layered, I think.
That's interesting.
It's really interesting, Tiff. Like, so I did some research on women working in TV, on TV political talk shows, and I came across exactly the same problem as I was asking these questions about gender, and there was a real almost hostility to it. Oh no, that's not affected my career in any way, and it makes it really difficult as a researcher, because you obviously want to give your participants voice and to explain things in their own terms. But if you can see a structural problem that's there and they're denying that, what do you do? Kind of yeah, but that's really interesting, Karen, that's not a problem that you've come across, that there is a real recognition of the inequalities that are pervading the space that they're in.
Yeah, maybe if I interviewed middle class white women, that might come out. Maybe. So it's really interesting.
That would be a really interesting comparison, wouldn't it, to do? Yeah. Great. Well, we've gone slightly over time, but I mean, that's, I think, because there's just so much to talk about, and I think we could go on talking a lot longer, but I'm conscious that you might all want to go for your dinner. So it just leaves me then to thank Karen really so much for such a fascinating talk, and for everybody for their really interesting questions and comments. Yeah, I think everybody's really appreciated and valued your time and hearing about your project, and we're really looking forward to seeing where it goes and keep you in touch to hear about the development of the project. Yes, and So yeah, thank you, Sally. Thank you for coming. If I don't see you all before, which I may not, have a lovely festive period and Christmas and New Year, and we'll have some more events in the new year, and maybe one day we'll have face-to-face events again, but who knows when that might be. But it's been really lovely to see everybody, and thank you so much for coming. And the recording will be available, so you can share it for others that I know that will be interested in it too. So have a lovely evening, everyone, and thanks so much, Karen, and thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everyone, and have a lovely festive break, everyone.
Thank you so much. It's been really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Just stop recording. Thank you, Karen. That was brilliant.